friends, good afternoon and welcome to EduSat Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in global environmental conflicts, we will be talking about oil and war. To discuss this topic, we have with us our subject expert, Mr. Atul Bharadwaj. Mr. Bharadwaj is Adjunct Fellow at Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Sir to our studios and request him to start the lecture. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Amrit, and good afternoon, friends. We're back to discuss war, and today our topic is oil and war. As you all know, oil is a commercial commodity, and from time immemorial, war has been very closely associated with commerce. However, this one particular commodity became one of the most engaging commercial commodities in the entire 20th century. So, we are going to study what is this correlation. Why did this relationship between this particular commodity and war became more intense in the last century? Who were the main players who engaged with this particular commodity and made it into such a crucial thing for the world? For the last 100 years, if you see, oil has been a frequent reason for war. Nations have fought wars or shaped their military strategies during the war to conquer oil fields or prevent rivals from controlling the commodity that is the lifeblood of industrial economies and modern militaries. Now, we all know today that we can't imagine life without oil. Oil is there in our motorcycles, in our cars, in aeroplanes, the electricity which is produced. So, there is a huge amount of human dependence now on this particular kind of fuel. Before this fuel came into existence in the world in the last century, we largely relied on coal. But this particular transition from coal to oil brought with it a lot of conflict and turmoil in the world. So, we are going to see how this turmoil happened, and this happened from the beginning of 20th century. The beginning of 20th century brought the Anglo-American quest for oil. The story began when, in a rush to secure and expand their own supplies in the region, the British, which was the predominant colonial power in the early years of 1900s, it landed an expeditionary force near Basra, which is now we all identify as Iraq. And this happened in 1914, the year when the World War I began. And the expeditionary forces which went to Basra also included a lot of Indian soldiers, because at that particular time India was under the colonial rule of Britain. So, lot of our Indians were actually engaged in Iraq in early 1900s. By 1980, the British captured Baghdad absolutely. They established themselves as well as they realized and positioned themselves in such a manner to control the oil reserves of Iraq, so that they could continue to be the dominant force in the world for decades to come. America also entered the stage at this particular time. America had their companies. The major company was Standard Oil at that particular stage in history, which was actually trying to acquire more and more oil assets across the world. So, Standard Oil of California, for example, discovered commercial quantities of oil in the eastern shores of Saudi Arabia, and thus began a relationship which would define the entire strategic outlook and of the whole world for the next 70 odd years. In order to understand oil and war, it is essential to understand oil in America. Why I say this is because by the end of the First World War, the British were on the decline. What history tells us is that America was the rising power after World War I. Britain had very little money left with it. It was more dependent on loans from America. So, it was getting indebted to the Americans. Therefore, when we discuss oil, it is very important to understand what was the American connection with it. As I have already told you that in 30s Standard Oil Company was to enter Saudi Arabia. The oil fueled American power and prosperity during the entire 20th century, if we see. The US was the world's leading oil producer for the first 3 quarters of the century. 5 of the 7 great oil corporations that dominated the international oil industry from 1920s to the 1970s were American. So, control of oil enhanced US military and economic might. It enabled it to reach far beyond its borders, and this actually enabled it to win both the world wars and also the Cold War, which lasted till 1991. So, let us now try and understand this American foreign policy and oil. Oil became one of the predominant commodities which fueled industry, industrial growth. The entire development philosophy revolved around oil, exploitation and extraction of oil. Now, controlling the oil supplies, the extraction process through the companies and its transportation channels through its navies became the prime objective of American foreign policy in this in the second half of the 20th century. In fact, it started becoming much earlier, and there was a lot of oil involvement in the entire way the Second World War unfolded. The US government, particularly in this case what we see, worked very closely with the oil companies that were based in the United States of America, and it maintained a control of overseas oil reserves. So, basically the entire strategy, if we see the American strategy or security strategy, was to build a kind of a link between national security and the interests of its oil companies. Now, to explain this fact further, I will tell you recently, if you have heard the news, we have something known as the United Kingdom has come out with a Chilcot report. It is on the reasons for the Iraq war, why Iraq war happened and why did United Kingdom join the war. Now, the report brings out how the oil companies were pitching with the parliamentarians in the United Kingdoms to demand more concessions for them from the United States at least 6 months before the war happened. So, there's always a very close collaboration happening between the governments and between the commercial interests of the companies, multinational companies largely, that operate abroad. So, that's exactly what the US government was doing earlier also, that it was trying to match the interests of its companies with that of the national security concerns. Maintaining access to oil became a key priority of the US foreign policy. Now, if you see here, it is not that the US was drawing out a lot of oil from the Middle East. US had its own huge reserves to depend upon, but yet the whole idea was that whatever happens, whatever moves on the oceans in terms of hydrocarbons and oils should actually happen under the US tutelage. So, United American policy both in Latin America and in the Middle East and other oil producing areas was largely governed by this logic of controlling, of maintaining, of being a systems administrator in the entire process of oil production and oil transportation and even oil pricing. Before World War I, the United States converted its ships from coal to oil as the main fuel for its warships. And oil was better than coal because it enabled ships to move faster. Once the ships had this kind of a fuel, they could operate to greater distances. And thirdly, the entire process of refueling the ships, warships, became simpler. If the ships could be refueled faster and in a simple manner, it meant that their turnaround time became far less. So, they could be at sea for much longer than what they could be earlier when they were operating on coal fuel. So, the oil powered the next big revolution in technology which happened was the oil powered internal combustion engines which came in, and they transformed the economy a great deal. So, these two issues, the extraction of oil and it leading it to greater technologies in terms of transportation, helped transform the economies. Oil also led to the development of other forms of warfare at sea. If we see submarines, airplanes, tanks, motorized transport that altered the physical, economic and social landscape almost completely. If you just imagine, the impact of oil. Now we see, now war is pretty much televised actually. We see motor vehicles moving fast speeds, we see helicopters, we see fighter jets, we see submarines. Now, all this probably would not have been possible had oil not been there to fuel the engines which were driving these machines. So, till now the world does not know any other fuel which can generate that kind of machineries. Although we are now working with solar powers, there are solar powered ships also coming in, there are solar powered aircraft coming in, but yet we are far from exploiting that kind of renewable energy for war fighting to the scale at which it was utilized since the First World War. Oil also led to the development of TNT. It revolutionized the manufacture of ammunition. So, there was a product called toluene which was extracted from the oil and which is essential in TNT, which is of course a very important ingredient in any ammunition. So, this correlation of oil with war and with industrialization of the entire war machinery began close to the First World War. And this led to a sort of one of the most bloodiest century in terms of violence and war. America and its oil dependence, if we have to look at that particular factor, the US accounted for almost 2/3 of the world's production in 1920. So, that is the hold of the United States on oil. It shaped its own economy to revolve around oil. It discouraged public transport and encouraged motorization of its cities. That means it encouraged more of individual cars and other things which would guzzle fuel initially to begin with, rather than depending on public transport. So, if you imagine, a bus can carry about 60 odd people, one bus, whereas one car can carry merely 4 people. And there are 200 odd cars which are required. 200 cars, the space that bus occupies is acquired by about 100 odd cars on the road. So, but US developed this because it had abundant oil, it was one of the major producers of oil. So, it developed its economy in a very different manner. So, it did not rely on public transport, metros or buses, but it encouraged people to buy cars. By 25, oil accounted for almost 1/5 of the US energy consumption, and by World War II that figure rose to 1/3. In contrast, if we see, outside the United States, oil was secondary fuel reserved mainly for transportation and military uses and accounted for less than 10% of energy consumption in Western Europe and Japan before the World War II. So, there was a huge asymmetry in terms of oil consumptions between Western Europe, Japan and the United States. United States was the leader in consumption, in production and in terms of holding the reserves. And that explains to us why and how America became one of the predominant powers of during the entire century. And it also explains to us why the British began to decline after the First World War, why the British Empire began to dismantle. Although it is not that the British did not control oil, as we have already seen that they did control oil in Baghdad, yet they were not the predominant power. There was some other power which was rising faster than Britain could actually catch up with. So, oil in World War I, what happened? We have all been discussing this. There was an easy availability of oil, which helped the United States Navy to project its power in the Pacific Ocean. So, for the first time, because it had oil, it had ships that could move faster, it had ships that could travel long distances. This enabled America to reach into the Pacific Oceans, and that is where the tussle begins with Japan. That is where the American engagement begins to happen with China. During World War I, the United States supplied more than 80% of Allied oil requirements. So, during First World War, when Germany was on the other side and America was with Britain, it supplied 80% of the Allied oil requirements. Once the United States entered the war, initially to begin with, the United States was a neutral country. It said that it will not participate in the war on behalf of any one particular alliance or any one particular country. However, as the war progressed, America got involved in the war, and America was actually forced to get into the war by its allies. So, then America began and started providing protection to the tankers which were carrying oil and which was being transported to the Europe at that particular time. So, this is how the entire oil history started shaping up, and its entanglement with war became more and more intricate. First World War finished, and then we have in the history what we identify as the interwar years, that is the years between World War I and World War II. The world oil supplies were unevenly distributed. We have already been saying that. The US and the Soviet Union were the only two powers with large oil reserves within their borders. So, now in the interwar years, in 1918, when the Bolshevik revolution happens in Russia, and subsequently Soviet Union comes up on the world map, then we begin to see a new kind of a war developing, because here was now a power which could compete with America in terms of oil reserves which lied within their own country, which meant that Russia did not have to go out to procure oil, and therefore was less dependent on United States that was providing protection to the oil supplies. So, this itself was a cause of tension between the Soviet Union and United States of America, which would develop into a more fierce battle, which we identify in the history as Cold War after the end of the Second World War. The British and the French had access to Middle East oil. They had little access to that because they were colonial powers, and they already had their companies operating in these regions. So, these companies had acquired some concessions from these countries, and therefore, they could provide oil to their countries. The British and the French could also depend on the US oil. Now, the German and the Japanese, if you see, are reliant on foreign companies. Russia is not, but Germany and Japan are. And this we are talking during the interwar years, the years when the Hitler is gradually coming up on the international scene. And there was no access to foreign oil fields. The German and Japanese had no access to foreign oil fields. Moreover, the Anglo-American sea power threatened Germany and Japan's access to oil from the Western Hemisphere and the Middle East. So, oil and interwar balance of power and what happens during the Second World War and Cold War we will be discussing in the next session. Welcome back, friends. Let us continue with our lecture. So, we were in the interwar years. Oil and the interwar balance of power is what we are discussing. Between 1928 and 1934, the US oil companies gained access to the fields in Netherlands, East Indies, Venezuela, Iraq, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. The US and the British companies lost access to Mexican oil in 1938. Mexico, close to the US coast, was another large oil producing country. However, the Mexican government in 1938 decided that it will not let the private companies run the show in the oil fields, but it will nationalize it, it will bring it under the state control. So, the British and the Americans were pretty annoyed with what had happened. So, they had to move out from there because larger chunk and the Mexican oil production also reduced in those years. But however, both the Anglo-Americans were able to compensate for the Mexican loss because of another development which happened in Latin America at that particular stage. Venezuela, which is another large oil producing country in the world, began coming up on the oil maps. The Americans industry started developing the Venezuelan oil, and Venezuela then became the third leading oil producer in the world, behind the United States and the Soviet Union. So, now imagine the scene. America is the leading oil country in the world. It also controls oil which is close to its coast in Latin America, Venezuela, which is the third largest oil producer in the world. America also has access in the Middle East. So, there is a huge amount of entire map of the oil map of the world is not dominated by the stars and stripes, the American flag. Now, we see Hitler coming into the picture again. Oil and Hitler, let us take a little bit time on this. Now, oil played, we all know, as we have been discussing, in the origins of World War II. Germany was short of oil. Germany did not have access to oil as France, Britain or America had. So, what did Hitler do about it? Hitler was a warrior, Hitler was a military man. So, he started extracting oil from coal. and producing synthetic fuel. Now, all this requires massive amounts of steel, coal and labor. But Hitler wanted to reduce his dependency on oil from outside, because he knew that the moment he launches his attacks or his military campaigns, this is one commodity which could be used by outside powers to exploit him, or basically to dismantle his entire strategic maneuvers. So, by 1940, the coal-driven synthetic liquid fuels accounted for almost 46% of the German peacetime oil supply and around 95% of its aviation gasoline. So, he made a lot of efforts to reduce his dependency in terms of oil. In November 40, Germany gained access, and 1939 World War II begins, and Hitler gains access to Romanian oil fields, but these are not sufficient to meet his requirements. So, what does he do then? He wants now, there is oil available in Russia. So, he says, why not to gather, why not to control that oil in the Russian region or the Soviet region, and then fight the war further and become the leader of the world. And thus began his entire quest for oil in Soviet Union. The German attempt to defeat the Soviet Union in a single blitzkrieg campaign failed in the summer of 1941. So, they launched a massive attack, a concentrated attack in 1941, but they failed to achieve their objectives. So, by June 42, the depleted German armies once again concentrated their best divisions in South Russia, and their objective again was to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus region. The German forces almost reached Stalingrad by August of 1942. However, the dilemma was to take the entire forces in the south to take over the oil, or should they move west to capture Stalingrad? Stalingrad was the center of power in the Soviet Union. So, this dilemma of the German forces was resolved by saying one section moves towards the oil fields and the other section moves towards Stalingrad. So, the entire German force, the depleted force which we are talking about, which came in 1942, was divided into two halves, each going in a different direction. The result was both failed and got defeated. And more than 1 lakh Germans surrendered at Stalingrad, and this marked the turning point in World War II and the end of Hitler's quest to be the leader of the world by acquiring a huge amount of oil reserves of the Russians. Japan was another Axis power. It was located in Asia. Japan had conquered some large portions in China. It was advancing further, dismantling the European empire in Asia. It went into Singapore, it went into Hong Kong. So, gradually it was advancing ahead, and the Dutch and the British colonies in Southeast Asia were falling under the Japanese onslaught. Japan had in the 30s developed shale oil in Manchuria, but the production was small and costly affair. Japan got 80% of its oil supplies from United States and 20% from Netherlands and East Indies. So, imagine when the war happened, the Second World War began, and Japan attacked the US Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Japan was actually drawing 80% of its oil from the United States. So, immediately, once the Japan tried to destroy the American fleet in Asia, the American imposed an embargo on oil imports to Japan. So, Japan could not get oil from its main source. Now, this could have been a grave strategic error. Japan was advancing to control Asia, and here it was actually making enemies with the same person that could fuel its approaches deeper into Asia. So, this is probably the biggest mistake one could say that the Japanese committed, because without oil they could not move further. Probably Japan thought that by capturing the Asian oil fields, they would be able to reduce the dependence on the United States. And they also calculated that by destroying the American fleet, they would be able to transport the oil from Asia to where they required it the most. However, their plans got dismantled. Their entire strategy failed, because the Americans used their submarines to blockade the transportation of oil from East Asia to Japan. So, what we see in the end is that attacking America was supposed to guarantee Japan unlimited oil, but instead it led to the destruction of its empire and its march into Asia. So, here we see a classic case actually. America, which is the biggest supplier, is attacked by Japan with the hope that until then America had not entered war. Till the Japanese attacked American fleet at Pearl Harbor, the Americans were neutral in war. They had said that we would not participate in the Second World War at all. But the moment Japanese did that, the Americans came into the war with their full might, and this led to actually choking the Japanese oil supplies, which eventually led to their downfall. So, we see both Hitler and Japan, Hitler's Germany and Japan actually moving ahead in the quest to acquire more oil, but failing in the entire process and losing out the battle completely. US and Venezuelan oil. As we already discussed, that the Venezuela became the third largest producer of oil after America, Soviet Union, and this happened in late 30s. In the US in 1943, the US government helped facilitate a settlement between Venezuelan government and the major oil companies that resulted in 50-50 profit sharing agreement. Confirmation of the company's existing concessions was also granted in the contract. The extension of those concessions for 40 years and access to new areas was also incorporated into the contract. Venezuelan oil production increased substantially and helped fuel the entire Allied war effort. After the war, the US government and the major oil companies cooperated with both democratic and authoritarian governments in Venezuela to maintain access to Venezuelan oil. So, a lot of turmoil which happened in Latin America post war also is related again to oil. So, oil we see now has caused commotion in Germany, it had caused commotion in Japan. All these were ambitious powers, Germany, Japan were ambitious powers, which did not have oil of their own and were absolutely dependent. They tried producing in-house oils, like the Germans have said, started producing synthetic oil from coal. The Japanese started producing shale oil, but their quantities were very limited. They were not enough to fuel their march into the world. US, which were controlling most of the oil of the world, had not entered war till it was really attacked by Japan. So, all this game was going on and US in the process was consolidating its oil reserves. And what was the American oil advantage in World War II? The key weapon systems of the World War II, whether it was surface ships, aircraft carriers, submarines, airplanes, including the long range bombers, tanks, large portions of sea and land transport were all powered by oil. The United States entered the war with a surplus production capacity of over 1 million barrels per day. And around 30% of the US production in 1941. This margin allowed US oil industry almost single-handedly to fuel not only the US war effort, but also that of its allies. US leadership in oil refining technology provided its military with huge advantages as 100-octane aviation gasoline and specialty lubricants needed for high performance aircraft engines were available with the United States. So, basically even if Japan and Germany had built the technologies, the US was controlling the fuel which could take those technologies or drive those technologies actually. So, this was the entire game which is happening during the Second World War. And German oil shortages we have already discussed in World War II. German synthetic fuel oil production from wells barely sufficient, failure to gain control of oil of the Caucasus, that is in Russia, the Germans had failed there. Then again in May 1944, Allied bombers targeted synthetic fuel plants, and by the end of the war, the German war machine was absolutely running empty of oil. The Japanese shortages also we have discussed. The Japanese gained control of Netherlands, East Indies in 42, but many of the oil facilities had been sabotaged and took time to restore to full production. More importantly, transporting oil from East Indies to Japan proved difficult after 43 due to the success of US submarines in interdicting Japanese shipping. By late 1944, Japan faced serious oil shortages with crippling military consequences and absolute defeat in war. Now we come back, World War I, World War II are over. Oil has played a big role in both these wars that we have seen, and now the world enters a new phase of war. This is the Cold War, the war between two major powers, great powers, Russia, Soviet Union, and United States of America. Now, here we see that both powers are self-sufficient in terms of oil production. both powers have ample reserves with each other. So, what happens in this particular war? The American aim is not to acquire the Soviet oil, or because to choke Soviet Union of oil would have meant going into Soviet Union and actually controlling the oil fields, which became very difficult for America because Russia was also a big military power. So, it was not possible to militarily acquire the Russian oil fields, nor was it possible to choke their oil supplies. So, what does America do in this particular case? So, the game was to play a political game in a manner that it would be able to contain Soviet Union. Rather than defeat, the purpose was to contain their expansion. Just as America had expanded to control the entire oil fields around the world, the idea was that Russians' expansion should be constrained somehow. So, what American did was they established military bases all around the world. The US sea and air power, from where the US sea and air power could be launched, the forces were also dependent on, all these forces remained dependent on oil. The US assumed a direct role in assuring Western access to Middle East oil, warning that growing Soviet power and involvement abroad, the third word, instability and Western dependence on Middle East oil threatened US security. So, what they did was that they ensured that all their allies remained together, which is Germany, Britain, Europe and other countries which fell into their orbit. They remained united. The Americans ensured that the Middle East provided them cheap oil to develop themselves, and so they industrialized faster, their economies became better. So, America ensured that its allies were happy basically, and they contributed to its war efforts. They becoming happy, or the capitalist world becoming happy with cheap oil, also resulted in showing that the prosperity was much better in a capitalist system than under a communist system. So, this is how the containment policy was being played out. One of the basic purposes behind US control of global oil production was to manipulate its prices in the international markets. Once you are controlling the production centers of oil, you are controlling the trade routes, that is the sea routes through which that oil is being transported, or the pipelines through which it is being transported, then you are able to manipulate the prices also. Now, these prices played a very important role in terms of containing Soviet Union. For example, in 1986, the oil prices fell sharply. Russia, which is trying to, which is also exporting oil, became a loser. So, Russian foreign exchange was not ample now. And this is the stage when Gorbachev was trying, in 1986 I am talking about, when Gorbachev was trying to open up his country, open up the trade and to make Russia more powerful. However, the high prices of oil prevented him, the low prices of oil actually reduced the Russian foreign exchange reserves, and Russia was not able to cope up. And this actually eventually led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, we see here how the Americans played out the game to win even the Cold War. So, all three wars, World War I, II and the Cold War, the US is able to use oil as a major weapon in all these three wars. The US and the Middle East oil. So, this is the the most important part in the entire game if we see. And here in 1980 Jimmy Carter said, let our position be absolutely clear. an attempt by any outside force to gain control of Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of United States of America, and such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force. And then we see excessive militarization of the entire Middle East region. In 1943, a US government sponsored oil mission surveyed the Middle East and concluded, and I quote, "The center of gravity of the world oil production is shifting from Gulf Caribbean region to the Middle East region." So this started in 1940s. Roosevelt and Saudi Arabian king, monarch of Saudi Arabia, met on USS warship Quincy in February 45. The meeting permanently linked the Middle Eastern oil with American national security interests. 20th century's most important strategic relationships developed, in which Saudis applied cheap oil to global markets under American protection. So Saudi Arabia here was supplying cheap oil, and the Americans had promised them to protect. So Americans were giving them military services for cheap oil. Since late 70s, the Gulf has been rocked by revolutions and almost permanent war. So the US protection did not bring much peace to the entire region. In fact, it made the entire region more militarized and more war prone. Oil and war have become increasingly interconnected in the Middle East. US approach to oil has also added fuel to the entire outcome in the region. The pattern of militarism that began in Persian Gulf in the 70s has partly been the product of American support for the deliberate militarization and of brutal and vulnerable authoritarian regimes. So it's not that America has promoted democracies in this regime or looked after the people's interests. They actually collaborated with the most authoritarian monarchs in the region in their entire process of militarization. Massive weapon sales to oil autocrats and decisions to build geopolitical military order in the Gulf that depended on and empowered those rulers resulted in a highly militarized and fragile balance of power in the region. The Iran-Iraq war, tanker war of 1980 and 88 dragged on for 8 years. Both sides struck at their enemy through oil. Iraq began the tanker war in 84 by attacking Iranian oil facilities and vessels trading with Iran. Iran struck back with air and naval attacks against Iraqi warships. Despite attacks on some 450 ships, neither side was able to devastate the other or to compel surrender. Tanker war led the United States into direct hostilities with Iran after American warships began escorting Persian Gulf merchant traffic. Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait in 1991, and this again leads to massive influx of the American forces into the region. About 5 lakh US troops land up in Saudi Arabia, and this absolutely destabilizes the region. Iraq had previously, and this we know that Iraq had previously been one of the major powers in the Arab world. So Saddam Hussein's quest for oil left it broken and isolated. Hitler, Japan, and Saddam Hussein, all's quest for oil actually devastated them. Cost of oil wars. The financial cost of maintaining a massive military presence in the Gulf region, according to Roger Stern, estimates that between 1976 and 2007, the total cost of maintaining the US military in the Persian Gulf was about $7 trillion. And the figure does not include the cost of 2003 Iraq war. Having crafted a set of relationships with oil and unstable oil producers, and having linked the fate of those relationships to American national security, virtually ensures that while United States is wrapping up the most recent oil war, its military and political strategists are already preparing for the next one. Here we see what the US has done is both its war in 1991 and in 2003, what it has led to if we actually see. It has led to the rise of Osama bin Laden, it has led to rise of Al-Qaeda, ultimately led to 9/11 attacks which devastated the United States. So, here we see that this entire game is now winding up. We see the earlier people who tried to use force to capture oil reserves lost out. Now we see United States, which for last 100 years have been using force, have been using manipulative strategies to manage oil or to control oil, is actually seeing the results for itself. The growth of Islamic terrorism is one of the worst outcomes of the destabilization of the entire Middle East region, in which USA has been the predominant power. For the American leaders and plenty of others throughout history, the price of oil indeed has proved to be higher than anyone could actually imagine. So, this tying up of a commercial commodity, which has actually led to great amelioration of the poverty in the world, has been manipulated and exploited to create a more violent world. So, this particular use or this particular misuse of the technology for creating a much worse world that we were living in has been a bane for the mankind. So, I would wrap up by saying that all new technologies need to be used little more judiciously by the leadership in the world to bring more peace and prosperity and not war to the world. Thank you.
On that note, I would like to thank sir for this very enriching discussion, and thank you dear friends for watching our show. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.